in my experience, I think so many people overestimate the impact that their personality or like the innate traits of who they are has on the actions that they engage in and the choices that they make, and the way they engage with other people in the world, and really underestimate the impact that the environment has on them and on the way they think about themselves.
Greetings, fellow explorers, and welcome to the 18th episode of Geekoscopy 101, the podcast that explores the nexus between science, story, wonder, and philosophy with me, your host, Dr. Jonas Kirsten. In this episode, we are exploring cognitive science, science communication, fantasy, and D&D together in a single podcast. Yes, today we're exploring the magic of the mind with podcaster and cognitive science communicator Morgan Sweeney. Let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the show, Morgan. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it is really interesting. I watched a couple of your episodes of Magic of the Mind, and I was quite enthralled. I enjoyed it. I need to schedule to listen to the rest. But yeah, it's really exciting. No, then I'm just coining new words on this podcast. Exciting and interesting. And I can't wait to hear about the whole conception of it. So why don't you tell us a bit about who you are in this moment and what you do?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I went into college thinking I wanted to do neuroscience because I'd always loved biology, psychology, a lot of the harder sciences. And then I got there and I really, enjoyed learning about everything. But the more kind of I learned, the more questions I had. And so I ended up switching from just a pure like hard science, neuroscience to a more interdisciplinary cognitive science. So I got to take classes in philosophy and linguistics, and computer science actually was also part of my degree, and just learn about what it means to think. I mean, so I've always been curious about people and about how people work and why they make the decisions that they do and why they are the way they are and who they are and what that means and how and why that changes. And I think it was just such a cool space for me to explore all these questions I had about people and the way we interact with the world, and to look at it from so many different perspectives of, from a biological perspective, how our brains and our like neurons interact with the world around us, but also emotionally, like what we think about the world around us and how that might differ from like what is actually there. And it was just, I don't know, it was such a cool space with so many interesting people and fascinating theories and just things that I always felt like I could take home with me. I think my biggest issue, with school when I was just growing up as a kid was like so often I felt like I would learn things that just didn't feel like they would mean anything or like help me in life at all. That's one of the things I love about, what I studied was it. After every, psychology class, I would come home and be like, oh, this is how my brain works. Or this is a possible way that I, see the world or change the way that I engage with other people. And it's been super, super cool to do that.
So after, I suppose, at the end of your time studying cognitive science, you decided to start a podcast to actually teach cognitive science, but using story and fantasy, and that ended up in the Magic of the Mind podcast. So why don't you tell us a bit about the whole premise? What is the Magic of the Mind podcast?
Absolutely. Yeah. So even when I was in undergrad, I always loved learning about these things. It was always so exciting for me to learn something new about myself and my mind and like the world around me and how I engaged with it. But I think day to day, part of me knew that what I enjoyed doing more than just pure research or, just pure reading and writing was just talking to people and telling stories that really engaged people and communicated concepts that, objectively might have felt kind of inaccessible or unimportant, but trying to format these ideas that have power into forms that people would actually engage with. And so growing up, fantasy was like my favorite genre of book, movie, TV show, like everything. I just loved fantasy because I felt like every story was so centered and grounded on who the characters were and like what was happening in the plot. I felt like each story just would kind of grab you and suck you into that world, and you would have so much to explore, so much to do, so many people to connect with, and like beautiful landscapes, and like there was just so much. It was such a rich genre that I always felt incredibly engaged by, and so I really wanted to make kind of a fantasy story that would talk about things that I thought were interesting and that would allow me to take concepts that I had loved and like learned about and had changed the way I saw the world, and like tell people about them, but not through like a classroom or like a textbook, through fantasy stories. And so that was kind of the beginning of the podcast, and the whole D&D part was just kind of happenstance. A guy I started dating my second year of school was actively involved in a Dungeons and Dragons group, and every Sunday he would like meet with his group, and it was like the highlight of his week. Like he was always so happy afterwards. And like I said, I'd always been into fantasy, so D&D was something that had kind of been like something I was interested in tangentially, but nothing I was going to seek out on my own. But then someone ended up leaving his group, a spot opened up, I joined, and just loved it. I think acting, performing, collaboration, there's so many aspects of D&D that, and just the people who I played with were so fun and became really good friends of mine. So that just kind of ended up like, I knew I wanted to write a fantasy story with concepts from cognitive science written in, and I just didn't know what the form would be. But then once I was playing D&D, I had a character for my D&D group. I had a world we built up, and a whole huge amount of lore to draw from. That just kind of made sense to me, of like, oh, I'm just going to set it in the world Dungeons and Dragons, use the character I already have friends of mine come on as like guest characters, just to make it a more collaborative effort.
Sure. I mean, it sounds really interesting. I think always the interesting about D&D, well, the interesting thing about D&D is it's so collaborative inherently, and it's so creative. You're creating your own story, and I find it very interesting when people take that that art and create other things from it. Did you guys ever think of like streaming your D&D game, or is it very too personal?
I mean, I just think, it was just, like 4 or 5 of us just like play. I mean, I'm not against the idea. I just don't think there's anyone who would care to listen.
Too much, yeah.
Because it's just the 4 of us like messing around. And I mean, there are some D&D podcasts that's literally just a bunch of comedians messing around, and it's like so enthralling and incredible to listen to. And I love my friends. I think they're all so funny, and when they come on the show, they're hilarious. I don't know. Just the idea of editing like a 2 or 4 hour, because they're pretty long. That I would just like, that was not ever something I was interested in doing, which is why I chose. Well, one reason why I chose audio fiction, because it's scripted. So it's what's going to happen, and we do improv on the fly. Like when it's friends of mine who are super funny, like we'll like ad lib a bit, and those are some of the best moments usually. But Lord, editing is such a such a big endeavor, and I can't imagine having that much material to start with.
No, it is a big thing. It's not a easy endeavor to do. And my stupid ass is thinking of starting a D&D stream, but it's not going to be a regular thing. It's going to be weird, but that's a story for another day. So. What is the reception for the show been? Like, what are you hearing from listeners, from other people, maybe in the cognitive science fields?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely been. So I remember when I had the idea before I'd even made anything, and I was telling people like, yeah, I want to make a fantasy podcast that like talks about different like cognitive science concepts. People were like, oh, that sounds really interesting. Like, I would definitely want to check that out. I think it's one of those, just the idea of it is so different and out there than anything. Well, at the time when I was producing, I thought, wow, no one's ever made anything like this. Now that I'm more in the space, I know, dugongs and sea dragons, and there's so many awesome, like, fantasy education sort of crossovers. So many people that are using the power of stories, and especially fantasy stories, to communicate concepts and to educate others, which is amazing. But before I got into the space, I was like, well, it's unique, it's different, and it still is. Every application is completely different from others that have come before it, just because the person who's doing it, my voice is super different from like everyone else's voice. But no, so initially before I had even made anything, people were really supportive. But then once I actually started making it on my, that was much scarier for me of I'm birthing a child. It's, I'm creating something with friends, obviously, but it's a very creative, personal process, writing and scripting and, building a story around a concept in psychology or cognitive, some of the concepts were more tangible. Some of them were language and relationships. Those are pretty understandable. But then I made an episode on attention and perception. It's what am I going to do with that? So then once the show actually came out, one of my favorite compliments, which this might come across as kind of weird, but it was a friend of mine who came and listened to the first episode, and he was it was so good that I wasn't even I didn't even realize it was you. I was so into character that he listened to my voice and completely got lost in the world I'd created and forgot. Because I think, if you've ever listened to something that a family member or a really close friend of yours has produced, you want to be supportive just because you love them and because you don't want to crush their dreams. And I am so grateful that I have friends and family members who are like that, who will support me no matter whether or not what I do is good. But it did mean a lot to me that this was not even an acquaintance who was I was just going to compliment it and say yeah, it's great. But I actually was really pulled in and I totally forgot it was you who was making this sounded like a genuine, I was a senior in college at the time. So it was this sounded like a real podcast I would listen to. So that was very exciting feedback for me. After that, yeah, I mean, a lot of people who just really everyone has their own favorite episode depending on what topic they're more interested in. So my older sister who loves languages, loves the first episode. Every episode that comes out, she's it was great, but I don't think I'll ever like anything as much as the first episode, which is valid. But from my perspective, the sound design gets so much better. I script better. The characters become more multidimensional as the show goes on. So it's, yeah, I mean, people across the board have been incredibly supportive. But I think anytime you do something creative, it's a scary endeavor, and you really you need that support from people around you. I don't think I would have been able to produce it had it not been for a number of people who were wow, this is a valuable idea, and I think this is something you should do. And it's still, we're still trying to grow and reach our audience. We're producing season 2 right now. But yeah, I don't know, it's been incredibly fulfilling in that way of people not only love the idea, but have really enjoyed the implementation of it, because there's a lot of ways to have a great idea and to make something, nothing you make will ever be as good as the perfect idea you have. That's, I think, a reality you have to come to pretty early on in the creative process. But I think having an actual thing that you're still happy with, even though it's not perfect or it's not, the amazing idea you first started with, that's really what I've enjoyed from it. It's just making something that makes me feel good and that I enjoy, and that the people that are interested in it also enjoy and are when's season 2 coming out? So that means a lot to me.
Do you record everything and release it in one go? Do you record everything and then release it in episodes?
Yeah, so for season 1, I typically work one episode at a time, because the structure of the podcast, so the way it works is I take a psychological concept and I write it into the plot of a story. As you know, this is for your listeners who haven't heard. And then each story is accompanied by an interview with a scientist and expert who studies that topic, to give sort of more background knowledge into what this concept is and how it actually works in the world, and also to give a little bit of context into what a scientist sounds like, and just to give, they're people who study this and they're interested by these questions, but they're not, just because they have PhDs doesn't mean they're totally different from anyone who doesn't. So it's kind of to give a peek behind the scenes and be this is how science is done. Often it's happy accidents and just a lot of work and a lot of going through data until something works out. And it's also just to give, because I think the fantasy story is a ton of fun to create. And sometimes the concepts are a bit more subtle. They're usually a central plot in the conflict. But having the interview with the fantasy story, I think, really allows people to not just listen and enjoy, but also to take something home with them and be yes, now I know how important relationships are to me, or why I feel sad more strongly than I feel happy. These sorts of things, takeaway messages people can take with them. What was the question? I got down on a tangent.
No, I was just wondering about your production schedule. But yeah,
That's right. Yeah. So I usually do one episode at a time, and that's because I have a psychological concept and an interview that I'm producing at the same time. So it's easier for me to just be like, I am doing this, and just focusing on like language, attention, and then moving on to the next subject afterwards. That was for season 1, kind of how I approached it. And I think that was good for me psychologically, and that I didn't feel like strung across too far. Season 2, well, and there's a meta narrative that I do have to outline before jumping in, because there are people out there who just like write and don't know where the story is going to go. I'm not one of those people. But I outline before I script so that I know kind of this is what this character is going to do, so that we can end up here, so that it still feels like a cohesive narrative, not just a bunch of like small stories. For season 2, it's been a lot more collaborative. So it's a lot of like reaching out to people, brainstorming, scripting, recording, editing, and it's a similar like one by one. But I think what I'm doing for season 2 is I'm just recording and just basically making the rough cut of everything, having all the dialogue where it needs to be, having all the interviews, like the important parts where they need to be. And then I'm going to, at the end of all the recording, probably just go through and sound design everything at once. I think sound design is some of my favorite part of the workflow, is like putting in music and sound effects. And it's one of the things that I think really distinguishes audio fiction and audio drama from other types of podcasts and other types of audio creations. And so I think, giving myself enough time to do that will really make me feel good about like the episode that I'm putting out into the world. And so I think for season 2, I'm probably like batching it in that way. Like I'm holding on to everything. And then at the end, I plan on releasing them probably 2 weeks apart, maybe 1 week apart. We'll see how the workflow is going at that point. But now I'm doing all the production at the beginning, versus last time I was doing production like one by one and releasing sort of every 2 weeks, and then COVID happened, so then I had to take a break. But so production schedule, because it's a seasonal show, it's a fiction, it's not like an interview where you only do one recording. Like I have to get a whole bunch of people and schedules, so it takes a lot longer, I think, than I anticipated, and that I think most podcasters who don't produce audio fiction would expect. But it's it's all part of the fun, and I really like the way it turns out, and I think it's something really cool, just making a completely fictional story online, like available to everyone. So
it's really cool. Sounds like a lot of work. But do you? Well, it always is. Creative processes are always. It's a labor of love, I suppose. Do you do your interviews with the scientists before recording or after recording?
Great question. And it honestly just depends on the topic. So for season 1, the first 3 topics were like language, attention and perception, and then memory. And those were concepts that I'd learned a lot about in like my college classes, that I felt like I knew enough about that I could write them into the script, just knowing what the concepts were and feeling like I could build off of those. And then doing the interview after the fact, so that I could tell the interviewer, hey, this is something that happens in the episode. What does this look like in real life? But then for the second half of the season, we went into emotions, relationships, and identity, which were 3 concepts that I hadn't really learned as much about, that I wanted more background knowledge in. So for those ones, I did do the recordings before writing the episode. And you kind of notice a shift in tone, and I do say that in the interviews, like what was before, what was after. But I think, and so for season 2, I think it's kind of a combination of like, I think generally we know what the episode, like we write the episode independently, and we have the ideas of like, what are the concepts we want to communicate, what are the general things we want to touch on, what do we think is important, and what do we want to come across to our audience. And then the interview allows us to kind of dive deeper into those and to give more context and to kind of explore them a little more. So I would say for season 2, definitely we're scripting first. We're like outlining the main points, scripting the episode, then going into the interview and allowing the professor to give like background. But I think there's more flexibility for the expert to like, share more things that they're interested in and more cool like facts about whatever the topic is in this way, because then it's less constrained by like, this is what we did, what do you think? It's more open-ended of like, these are some things we talked about. What's your experience with this? What do you think, like, what are ways we can take this into our own life? It's a little bit more, integrated because the episode's been pre-written.
For sure, yeah. I was just wondering whether, like, a chat with the scientists might change the narrative in some way.
Yeah, I mean, and if there is something we've gotten wrong, we definitely will go back and do that. But usually, before writing an episode, I usually do research or, look back through my notes or whatever to make sure it is. And that's one of the big reasons we decided to have an expert, like an interview, just to make sure that I wasn't miscommunicating anything or misconstruing anything or leaving room for, ambiguity where there really shouldn't have been.
So beside the D&D setting, what are some of your other big inspirations for the show, whether it's fantasy or other podcasts, anything to do with the production? Like, what are your major draws for inspiration?
Absolutely. Yeah. So on the fantasy side, the Kingkiller Chronicles, which is like The Name of the Wind and The Wise Men's Fear, are the two that are out. We're still waiting for the third one, and anyone who has read the series knows how frustrating it is that we're still waiting 8 years later.
Jeez, that's
but that is 8 years. This guy, and it's a fantastic. It's incredibly well written, so poetic. It's told in a first person perspective, so it's an I story, which I've always found to be the most, like, that resonated with me the most is first person narratives. Like, this is my story, this is what I did, which is one of the reasons that Eve, my character, is also the narrator, because you create such a close bond with that protagonist, and I think that really, I think the heart of storytelling is characters and connections to other people or animals or things, but just connection, basically. And so having a narrator that's your main character really heightens that for me. And just such poetic descriptions and an incredibly well thought out and tangible world are all the things in the Kingkiller Chronicles that I love and that I really try to write into my podcast. And just fun characters and like silly side scenes and like, I don't know, just an atmosphere that feels upbeat. There are definitely dark parts of the Kingkiller Chronicles that I haven't brought as much into my podcast, but that's on the fantasy side, that for sure. On the podcasting side and kind of the science communication side, Radiolab was the podcast that got me into podcasts. I think like Radiolab was just the most amazing science I mean, they would take these concepts like right and wrong or like the value of life or lying and telling the truth, just like really abstract, interesting concepts that are so ingrained, like such parts of our everyday lives, but that we don't take a lot of time to like consciously consider. And they would just create art. Like they would, splice interviews with experts with like personal narratives from people who have like really great like experiences with these topics with, some good old fashioned, like just radio, just like Jad and Robert, just like talking and like chilling. And the sound design. I think what really set Radiolab apart, at least to me, and still does, is the sound design that they have. I think there are so many incredible long-form journalism podcasts that tell incredible stories and use the voices of people who study these things, who have experienced these things, and intersplice in such a creative manner. But I think to me, at least when I first started listening, what really set Radiolab apart was the way that the music and the sound made you feel like you were experiencing the thing they were talking, or really just hearing people talk is in itself an amazing thing, but layering the music and the sound design over that makes you feel it on a level that I think is completely different than just hearing someone's voice tell a story. That was one of the really big reasons I wanted to do audio fiction, is because I really wanted to have that sound design and that extra element that it really brings to the listener when you're hearing. You're not just hearing a story, you're imagining it in your mind because the sounds are making it real around you, not just something you're listening to through your headphones. Those are the big things I loved about audio fiction. In the audio fiction space, I loved Welcome to Night Vale. That was definitely my first podcast in the audio fiction space that I listened to. And Dungeons and Daddies too is like definitely a favorite of mine. And just, I don't know, having that combination of charisma and just like fun character relationships and just a really well fleshed out world and just intriguing intriguing plot points. But I'd say at the heart of it, what I love about podcasts and why I love making podcasts and listening to podcasts is the people that you get to hear and you get to meet and you get to connect with. And that was really what I was trying to make with my podcast.
It's quite a breadth of inspirations you have, and I've heard of some of them. I've listened to a few episodes of Radio Lab. They are quite cool. Never listened to Dungeons and Daddies, but I've heard about it. The only D&D podcast
it's so funny if you like D&D podcasts.
I'll give it a try. But I mean, like watching Critical Role already takes out like a big chunk of my week. And then I recently...
True, yeah. You can only have so many D&D podcasts.
Yeah. And I recently went back and rewatched some Acquisitions Incorporated, and that put me in a better mood. But yeah, I'll check out Dungeons and Daddies at some point. So while you were... recording and writing and scripting out things, what were some of the major either setbacks or kind of challenges that you faced that you might be able to share with people so that they don't do those things maybe? So what were the stumbling blocks that you overcame?
Absolutely. And it's actually... I think it's really interesting because for me, a lot of the biggest challenges weren't necessarily like in the work itself. Like before I started podcasting, I thought audio editing and like sound design was going to be so hard and so challenging. And it wasn't easy. Like I definitely had to try and fail and try again. But, it's one of those things you just get better with over time as you watch more YouTube tutorials and ask Google a million questions. But it's actually, at least in my experience, the hardest thing about making a podcast, and especially like a really time-intensive one like the one I do, isn't actually making the podcast. Like for me, I love scripting. I love I love talking to people. I love making this thing happen. The hardest part is like working it into my everyday life, is figuring out like where am I gonna make this time to make sure I'm able to script, how am I going to schedule it so I'm able to record with this person who's only available at this time? How am I going to fit 10 hours of editing into this week where I'm already working 40 hours and, making dinner 3 nights eat? Like it's less of a problem of like actually, when I'm I love, like once I start scripting, it's great. I'm having a great time. Once I start editing, again, I love it. And once I'm starting it, I'm there. I think the hardest thing for me is just finding the time for it and like really marking that out and making sure I'm only working on podcasts during that time. And I think just forcing myself to start, really just making sure there's an incentive for me and someone who's like, not like checking up on me, but like who cares, who's like there kind of like, I don't like
an
accountability, I guess. Making sure there's someone who's holding me accountable for my actions when it comes to this show. Because again, I love making this show and there are people who really enjoy it. But, when you have to, when it's like 8 p.m. on a Sunday and you're like, well, I could work or I could, it's easy to be like, well, I could just watch like one episode of something else and then not do it. So I think the biggest thing that has helped me personally in like making that workflow fit into my life better and like keeping that accountability is having a friend that I co-work with. So like we'll at a certain time every day, we hop on a Zoom call, we chat for like 5 minutes about our lives, like catch up, and then we work the rest of the hour just on like projects that we both have. And it's really, not only is it a friend that like I love and I love seeing, so like I always want to talk to her. So just, having that, like having her there and knowing that like that's almost a reward for me, like getting to see my friend really makes me show up and sit down and just start whatever it is. And then once I've started, it's fine. But that's been the biggest thing for me is like, how do I get myself to start and just put in the time and make this happen? And so having someone I meet with or someone who, at set times, like it's at the same time every day, 5 days a week, that we do it together, and a couple evenings a week as well. So that's really made the biggest difference for me, is just having that set time and having someone there to encourage me and reward, reward me, like make me feel good and feel like I'm doing something valuable. Because sometimes, my intrinsic motivation isn't quite enough to put in the amount of time that it just takes to produce a podcast like this.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good tip. I think I need to also indulge in one of those. Get me a
It's hard,
accountability
dude. People
partner.
who don't make podcasts like think it's like you're just chatting on a microphone, and you are, but there's so much in post-production and like if you're scripting, and like it's not a small time commitment, and you really have to set aside time for it.
Yeah. I mean, just getting a hold of people, scheduling. I mean, it's that's time that you use for recording and editing afterwards. And then all the social media marketing that goes into it. It's a lot.
Oh yeah.
I wouldn't say it's. I mean, my version of podcast is probably the easiest version, but it's still a lot. So I can imagine like super hyper like production value like yours. I can only imagine and not envy you at all. Not want to be you at all. So when it comes to your time studying cognitive science, like what were some of the things that you learned that you think everyone should know? Like what should be general knowledge that just isn't?
So something I think everyone should know, and I think this is something a lot of people kind of know, but not to the extent that is really reflected in everyday life, is how much of an impact our environment plays on who we are and the actions we engage in. I think, and this is something that's still being debated in the field of neuroscience and psychology and cognitive science in general. The nature versus nurture question has gone on since the beginning of time, and there still isn't, an exact percentage or an exact answer. But, in my experience, I think so many people overestimate the impact that their personality or like the innate traits of who they are has on the actions that they engage in and the choices that they make, and the way they engage with other people in the world, and really underestimate the impact that the environment has on them and on the way they think about themselves and the actions that they take. I mean, same thing. For an example, like if you are someone who spends a ton of time on your phone, and you're like, well, it's just because, I'm addicted to my phone. I'm inherently, I have an addictive personality. I just, this is a part of who I am. I am someone who's on my phone a lot. Well, they've actually done studies that, instead of keeping your phone on a place where you can see it, where it's, visually accessible, on your desk or, out on a table, if instead you put it in a pocket or in a drawer, a pocket of your backpack or in a drawer in your dresser or something, and it wasn't visually accessible to your brain, you would just pick it up a lot less. You would, in that context, because beforehand your environment was giving you this cue. Your phone's out, you hear it ring, you hear something happen, you go pick it up, you're on your phone for however long, and it happens a lot more often because it's there in your environment. However, if you put it in a drawer, if you put it away, you're not visually seeing it, you won't, that's not a cue your environment's giving you anymore. You're not just going to pick up your phone. You have to actively seek out your cell phone, and then you'll be on your phone a lot less because it's not, your environment's not showing you it anymore. There's no longer that cue for that action that you engage in. And so I think, and this is across the board, I mean, so many things that we do day to day that we think are, and, in large parts, they are pieces of ourselves. The things we do shape who we are, and shape how we interact with the world. But changing even just a small thing about your environment, can really alter the way you behave in that environment. And I think, pre-COVID days, a lot of people understood, when I'm at work, I'm doing work, whereas when I'm at home, I'm, relaxing, doing things at home. It's actually a really profound impact that it can have on your mental state and the way you engage with things in your environment. And I think this is definitely something I've tried to bring into my own life of if my physical space around me is messy, if there's stuff everywhere, if, it's dark, if it's cold, if there are things there that make me worry about something that isn't the thing I'm supposed to be focusing on, I'm just not going to be able to focus. And that's not because I don't have good focus or because I'm not good at doing work or any of these things. It's no, I haven't set myself up for success. My environment isn't helping me do this. It's not, it's not about me. So I think this is one of the biggest things that I have found really helpful for my own everyday life and for kind of being nicer to myself when it comes to engaging in actions that I want to do is not being like, oh, it's my fault. Like, I'm not motivated enough to work out, or I'm not, motivated enough to eat healthy. It has nothing to do with your motivation. It has everything to do with like literally what's there in your environment. Like if your chips are out on the table and your vegetables are in the fridge, it's a lot easier to get chips than it is to like go into your fridge and cut up a carrot. Like so much of the decisions we make are subconscious. And so really making sure that you're able to, take control of those, just be more aware of what decisions you're subconsciously making, and allowing yourself to choose if those are decisions you still want to make. And if not, figuring out how you can reshape your environment to encourage yourself to do the things that you want to do. I think there's so much psychology and design in, and especially in COVID when you're at home all the time, and like shaping your environment to be a place that allows you to be the version of yourself that you want to be. And yeah, like adjusting your cues and like visual input accordingly. All input, but especially visual input, because we're visual creatures. So we're more attracted to like seeing something on a table than like hearing a sound, for example, or like, smelling something. Like if you smell something bad, it's annoying, but like it's fine. Whereas if you see a flashing light, it's really hard to look away.
For sure. I suppose that's where the notion of out of sight, out of mind comes from. And I suppose you get apply that in reverse as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like if you hide something away from yourself, you'll forget about it. Like if you put your weights in the back of your closet, you're probably not going to work out as much. And that's just part of human nature, and it's nothing wrong with who you are. It's just the way we work.
Indeed. What do you think about the current landscape of science communication? Do you think we are doing enough? Do you think there's room for improvement? Do you think that stuff people are doing wrong, or scientists at least? What's your overall thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm still a relative newcomer. I've been writing science articles for the last 3 years, but as far as science podcasting and the greater like online science communication sphere, I joined Twitter like a year ago. So I'm still pretty new, but I think the way I view science communication, and I guess this is very much informed by, the internet centric media that is most of what I consume. I know that for science communicators who write in like print or broadcasting, it's super different. But at least from what I've seen on the internet, I think there are so many people who are creating amazing science communication content. So many PhD students or postdocs or professors or, scientists who care about the things they do and want to make it accessible to people and are making, podcasts or like Medium blogs or things like this where they really want to share what they have with other people. And I think that's incredible. And I think what it comes down to, from my perspective, and this is a very like US centric view of media, because that's where I grew up and the media I consume is in the US. I think really what it comes down to, because in my mind, there's so many purposes for science communication, right? You can communicate science because it's something you personally love and you want other people to engage with or, learn or whatever, but it's an intrinsic thing. Like, I want to do this because it matters to me. I think that is so valid and so valuable, and I love that. And that's one of the reasons I love being in the science communication community, because there's so many people who have such cool things they want to tell people about, and I love that. But I think the other purpose of science communication, and this is, on the broader perspective, is to inform the public and policymakers at the governmental level. And I think this is especially important when it comes to, things like climate change or pandemic preparedness, things that we really need the public and the government and the people in power to understand how urgent and how important these things are. Or, in the case of politics, like the voting block of people to understand and to vote accordingly. Because, at the end of the day, like, it doesn't matter what people think, like, climate change is happening, and it's really just a question of how badly it's going to affect us based on what our governments do and how effectively they can respond. So I think when you're coming from that strategic perspective of like, no, we need action now. I think from that perspective, science communication needs to be a lot more targeted and a lot more just effective. And so again, this is a problem that I think the government or some, I don't know, it's a big question. And this is, and I've actually applied for a PhD in media studies, that if I get accepted, I will be studying this specific problem of how do you reach audiences? How do you reach people that aren't interested in science, that don't care about climate change, that think climate change isn't real? How do you reach them, and how do you convince them that they're wrong? You know, that climate change is happening and that it's important and that we need to create policies and change the way our world works in order to cope with this new reality. And it's not an easy question, and it doesn't have an easy answer. But I do think this is something we really need to think about, is not only how can we reach people who care about science and are interested in science and, you know, want to learn about the world, but how can we reach people who don't care about science, who don't give a shit about the planet? Because we need them to vote as well, and we need them to support progressive policies that protect people and protect the environment. And it can't matter, you know? And I think this comes back down to like a really big problem in media just across the board, is like the way media is structured, most media companies, so not all, and especially Web 2.0, like we have Patreon, we have Coffee, like we have different ways that audiences can support like producers and creators, but generally media is supported by advertising. Social media, video, TV, like pretty much any media you can think of, the way that those people who make that media are paid is usually by businesses or private corporations who are paying them to basically give the corporation some of that media company's audience's attention. So basically, like, the whole idea is if you're not paying for media, you know, if you're like looking on a blog or like something that it's free for you, there's probably ads there. And so the media company, even though it's free for you, they are being paid for your attention. That corporation is paying the media company so that they can have access to your eyeballs and your brain during that span of time. So if it's a YouTube video, it's like 5 seconds or whatever. But that's still your attention and your like space in your brain that the corporations are buying from media companies. And that's just the only way media companies can make money a lot of the time is through advertising, because we've created a media system where people don't expect to pay. And again, there are totally exceptions. There are magazines, there are newspapers, there are podcasts where subscribers will pay money to their creator. And I think that's incredible. I think that's where more media needs to go, is subscriber supported. That's how all media used to be before the advent of radio. But it's a system that relies on selling the attention of the audience and the consumers and the listeners. And in that, you know, and so then in that industry, like when this industry is set up this way, you cannot create media. You cannot pay the people who create media unless your audience is actually consuming what you're saying. And you can't create unpopular media because it's not going to sell. You're not going to be able to pay your people. You're going to go out of business. And so I think it's not just a simple question of like what we should do and what I wish science communication was doing. I mean, it is that, but there's so many things at play of like, and you know, all comes back down to capitalism of like, if the only thing that matters is making money and, you know, looking out for yourself, it's really hard to create space and have like literally pay people enough to live to do this kind of work that's incredibly important and will shape the future of, you know, our country and the world. But we just live in a system that is so hard to do that kind of work, that has so many like hoops to jump through and so many barriers to making this thing that should be simple. Take a message that's really important and give it to the people who need to hear it, and give it in a way that they'll actually respond to it. It doesn't sound that hard, but when it comes down to the reality of it, of like, you know, who are you going to pay to do this? How are you going to reach them? Some people don't have internet. Like, how are, like, you know, just really, who are these people and how can we reach them, and how can we inform them in a way that they still feel empowered and still want to do things and not feel kind of disenfranchised or excluded from the conversation. It's not an easy question, and I wish I had a better answer. But that's kind of my perspective of science communication, is like, there are so many people doing amazing work who are expressing, you know, the things they love and communicating those to others. And that is so awesome and so empowering. But I think on the other hand, we do need really strategic, really organized, and really large scale kind of communication endeavors that are made to reach audiences that aren't the audiences that are going to enjoy science just off the bat. You know, we need to reach people who probably have some pushback, and for some people that's like a valid reason. They felt just like not included by scientists in the past, and that's super valid. But that doesn't change the fact that our planet's still dying. Like, we still need to do this work, and so government support, you know, having a financial like a way to make money in this industry that doesn't rely on private businesses. I think these are all things we need to do in order for that to happen. So it's a complex thing, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. No, for sure. I agree with a lot of what you say. Like, I've also, well, like I think that science has a big like marketing problem. Like, in that there's no marketing. Like, when you get your research funds, when you get your research funds as a scientist, most of it just goes towards doing the science and, you know, all of the logistics involved in that. But there's no budget per se for communicating, marketing your science. And I mean, it's understandable why. And that's why, like, it needs like government funding. Like you said, like we need big media campaigns around the most important messages, and we need a bunch of scientists, we need a bunch of communicators, artists, like just a bunch of people involved to make the best possible media campaigns that we can to try and get the message out there. Because, I mean, startups like you and me, it takes a long time to build an audience. Like, our reach is not going very far, even though we would like it to. And if you have the money, you it's a bit easier, but generally no one starts out with a bunch of money. And also expertise, access to expertise, collaborations. It's a difficult endeavor. So it does need, I think, government level push if we want to be serious about it. So I agree with you. Hashtag, where's the marketing budget in the research funds? That's
True. No, you're absolutely right. And that's something I think about quite a bit. I mean, you know, currently I'm doing marketing for a machine learning company. That's one of the reasons I'm doing this job, is because I'm trying to figure out, how does marketing work? How can we use this for policy-based messages? Because it's exactly that. It's a branding and it's a marketing problem that science has that makes people not respond to it. And I think that's something that, with government support and funding, we could absolutely work on changing. So I'm glad you think the same way.
Yeah. It's one of the things that keep me up at night. How do I help this problem? And yeah, it's a lot of it has to do with money. And also, I mean, kind of the political
why we do this, right?
Yeah. For sure. So let's try and maybe raise our spirits a bit and talk about Magic of the Mind Season 2. Season 2 and beyond. Like, what can we expect to change in the new season? I think you spoke a bit about it. But how would you like... Where would you like the show to be in like 5-10 years time? Like, what would you like to add? What types of new either technologies, either people involved? Like, what would you like to see happening with the show in the future?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so on the long term, like, you know, my dream is to have, it's not have to do all the work myself. It's to have a team of people who are good at each of these individual tasks. I'd probably still script, but like, to have a sound designer, an editor, to have, you know, an assistant to help schedule things, and to create, you know, things much more regularly, because I'm one person, I don't have the bandwidth to do it all at once, but with a team of people, we could do it at least in a much more efficient time period. I think kind of at the heart of what I love about my show, and the thing that really makes me want to keep creating it, is the collaborative spirit, is like collaboration with people who I think are so smart and so creative and so funny and so interesting. And that's, that's what I love, and that's what I want to keep happening. I still want to always bring in people who feel like their ideas are valued and who are able to use this really unique format of like writing a fantasy story to communicate something that they have been feeling, or something they've gone through, or something that they just think people should like know about, or like would like to tell people about. So that's kind of how I've structured season 2, is like each episode kind of has a collaborator, like a main character. And the way kind of it's structured, like behind the scenes, is like the person comes in, I'm like, okay, cool, like, what's something you want to talk about, and like, what's your character look like? And so sometimes we'll brainstorm together, workshop, be like, okay, well, these are the things we want to hit. So a couple kind of episode topics, if you're interested, are our first episode, we're talking about discrimination and racism and biculturalism and the benefits of diversity, but basically at its heart, racism. It's an incredibly important topic that I think everyone who has a platform should talk about. And so I'm really excited for it to come out. And then we're talking about personal boundaries and like how to know like what you need and how to be able to communicate that to someone else. Because I think that's also super important. And again, these are people who came to me who were like, hey, I have this idea. I want to write an episode about it. I'm like, let's do it. Doing one on like burnout and perfectionism and a lot of, the internal pressures people put on themselves and kind of ways to try to overcome that, anxiety. I mean, just a lot of things that different people have experienced, and trying to use, everyday conflicts that, and trying to make something out of it and create something that hopefully at the end will be able to help someone, who will listen and see themselves reflected in it, and feel like they know a little bit more about themselves and hopefully are a little better equipped to deal with whatever that problem is for them, whatever that conflict is within them. Because I think, I don't know, it's very like artsy, but like, everyone is constantly creating their own life, writing their own story. And so the more tools, the more like knowledge that you have, the easier it is to figure out how to solve whatever problems it is you're dealing with. And so the heart of it, that's kind of what I want my show to do, is I want to provide information and resources and things that not only like make people feel like they have control over, the way they think and the way they engage with the world around them and the way they approach their life, but also like bring people joy, because I think that's also what good entertainment and good media does, is it makes you feel connected to someone or something outside of yourself. It makes you feel like life has more dimensions than you had seen in your own little world. And so, whatever format that takes, whether it ends, whether we will go to a TV show or like a YouTube, whatever, like, and podcasting, I love podcasting. I love the connection you feel with people. And on the production side, I love not having to color correct for 10 hours a day, like video editors have to do. So I don't have as much a clear vision for like, what it'll look like or where it'll be in 5 and 10 years. But I know at the heart of it, what I want for people to come away with is to feel like there's a group of people who are their friends, like fantasy characters or me or the, professors we interview or whatever it is. But there's people out there looking out for them and trying to do things or trying to give something that will make them feel more empowered and like they're able to, shape their own life the way they want. Because at the end of the day, like, I'm just like a content creator. Like I'm just making something. It's your life and you get to decide what you do with it. I just hope that I'm able to do something that is helpful and makes you feel happy. And, if that's a long-term happiness, a satisfaction, if I'm able to give you some sort of information that is able to make your life better in the long term, that's amazing. Like that's definitely my goal, is like I want to make people's lives better in the long term through the messages I create and through the stories I tell. But even the short, like if you just want to lose yourself for like 20 minutes and just like be in a silly fantasy story, like that is still joy, and joy is still hard to come by in this day and age. So I don't know. I want to make people happy, and I want to do things that make people feel good about themselves and the world they live in. Or at least better, if not good, because our world's kind of fucked up. But at least better.
Yeah. I think that's a general goal for everybody, to just leave the world better than you found it. And I think that's a good note to end the podcast on. So thanks, Morgan, for joining. It was really fun chat. But before we go, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Absolutely. If you're on Twitter, I'm on Twitter. My tag is @Morgan Sweeney with 3 Ys. That's my Twitter. And then if you want to listen to Magic of the Mind, we are a podcast. We're on every podcasting platform I can think of. Just type in Magic of the Mind and it should pop up. We're also on Twitter @MagicOfTheMind1, on Instagram @MagicOfTheMindPod. People just use Google these days, so you can just like type Magic of the Mind podcast into Google, and it'll probably give you like all the links you've ever wanted. And so, yeah. So I would love, and just like reach out to me. I love making friends. Again, like that's the whole reason I do this kind of work, is because I love meeting people and I love creating things with other people. So if anything I said was like interesting to you or resonated with you, feel free to reach out, talk to me. I love making new friends, and that was one of the reasons like I was so excited to come on this podcast. It's because Janas does an amazing job like interviewing people and finding people who do awesome work in this like really creative and like weird little niche of the internet where we do science communication, but also like entertainment. You know, it's not just pure write or talk. It's like it's a very creative space. That's a unique thing to find, and I think we need more. We need more of that. And hopefully, you know, we can band together and create something bigger with all of us versus just one at a time. So reach out, be my friend. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for joining. Yes, we need more of you and me and everybody. Everybody to do a bit more to, like we say, leave the world a better place than we found it. So thanks for listening, everyone. And we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.